nation, the religious nation, the self-reliant nation, the destined nation, the immigrant nation, the capitalist nation, the anti-intellectual nation, the innocent nation, and the future nation. All right. Tonight, the native nation. So, another thing we're doing here, we're talking about American identity, and the way you construct identity is through myth. And again, probably don't need to explain this to this group, but by myth, I mean a religious studies term, not a popular culture term. The myth of the sensitive man, or whatever. I don't mean a falsehood. I also don't mean a particular story, Perseus and Medusa, for example. I don't usually mean that. There are a few stories along the way, but what I'm talking about is something much deeper. A story that is so true, that runs so deep, that you acted out without even knowing. So if you're an American and if you've ever visited Europe, say, or another country, you've felt that story. You felt it being pushed against, maybe challenged a little bit. You realize maybe you were speaking too loudly in a museum or something. I'm just kidding, but you know the stereotype of Americans in Europe. When you get uncomfortable, that myth is being challenged. When you get angry, that myth is being threatened. And all you have to do is turn on cable TV, and you will see myths, these deeply held truths being challenged, and people getting pissed off about it and screaming. All right? So, right, I mean a story. We're going to get into this notion of truth, too. By truth, I do not mean Platonic truth. I mean experiential truth, not ontological truth. I mean truth and a story that is active, not inert. We know a lot of inert stories. You can go into our bookstore and pick up a book on mythology. Most of those are inert. They're not active. We're going to talk about the stories that are active for us, all right? And because they're active, and because we are in Western culture, they are hidden. All right? We'll get into why that is, but they're hidden. So we're going to try to bring those out, see them. It's a little bit like, I started to say Achilles, Archimedes, trying to move the world. Remember, he was the great Greek mythological engineer, or not mythological, but he thought about where would you stand to move the world? That's what we're doing. We're standing inside of our myths and trying to step outside and analyze them at the same time. So it's difficult, maybe impossible, but we're going to do it anyway. All right, we'll also talk about some functions of myth, but I don't want to get into that now. If you know Joseph Campbell at all, you will recognize these functions. They are the metaphysical, the cosmological, the sociological, and the psychological. These are the functions that create identities for human beings. These are the functions that create identities for cultures, or in this case, nations. As always, this is not a formal lecture. It's really a discussion, so feel free to talk or ask me. Well, no, don't talk, but ask me questions along the way, if you like. So, before 1492, what do we talk about? We talk about the continent. We talk about the landmass, which is huge, right? From what is now Alaska to what is now Chile. That's what we're talking about, because the borders are arbitrary, artificial, created, political lines, not any other kind of, not natural lines, not even cultural lines. This new world, of course, was ancient and not new. People have been living here for a long time. The domestication of plants took place about 8,500 BCE in 7 areas on the globe, as you might imagine. It's around river valley. It's in river valleys. 3 of those are in the Americas. What makes the continent live is the combination of corn, beans, and squash. Lauren, I don't know, maybe you know this, but that's a unique combination of proteins, I understand. Is that fair? Yeah. That's uniquely suited for human consumption and not just consumption, but for thriving in the environment. The people who lived here were relatively disease-free, and that's largely because of their diet, as Lauren will tell you. You can follow her on Instagram if you'd like to know more. Yeah, corn and fish, right? So that's a pretty good diet. No sugar, no refined sugar, no refined anything. And also hygiene, remarkable hygiene. Some of the early European visitors to the continent were struck and kind of confused, maybe even appalled by how often people on the continent bathe. They're like, every morning, these people bathe. What's wrong with them? These were Europeans, of course, who were not especially fond of bathing. The population on the continent is obviously hard to determine, but the best guesses, and I've looked at this for a long time, the best guesses seem to be about 100 million people. And again, this is by definition a sustainable group of people, groups of people, right? They're not interested in conquest except, just maybe tribe to tribe occasionally, with some tribes. They're interested in just surviving, right? Vine Deloria Jr., a great Native American philosopher, said that there's no salvation in tribal religions apart from the continuance of the tribe itself. That's all they want, right? And to do so, invariably, they sublimated their own desires to those of the earth and the animals and the ecosystem in which they lived. That's not a romantic notion. We're going to talk about romanticizing them, the people who lived here. So what was this continent like before 1492? It was rather amazing, and this is a story that just as amazingly does not get told. I didn't hear this in school. I doubt, maybe it's changed now, I don't know, but what I was taught was that this was a pristine land just waiting for good English folk to come and colonize it. On the contrary, there were major cities, city-states, and civilizations, along with other scattered bands of people all over. For example, the Maya. And we could spend 10 weeks just on these cultures, but obviously we're going to do more than that, talk about more than that. You may know about the Maya. They were incredibly sophisticated in terms of astronomy and also astrology in a way that was not contradictory. They levied taxes to build their infrastructure, which makes sense. They had tremendous art, architecture, sculpture, painting, as I said, mathematics, astronomy, and writing. Handwriting. Mayan hieroglyphics are, they're hieroglyphics. They're kind of ideograms. But they are writing, and they were incredibly difficult to translate. Teotihuacan, Mexico City now, incredible center of culture and life that housed the Olmecs, then the Toltecs, then the Aztecs. They had libraries and schools. They were themselves at war. The Toltecs take over the Olmecs, the Aztecs take over from there. It is a massive city-state that, again, is centered on corn, and very complicated palace intrigue and such. In fact, the whole story of Moctezuma and Cortez that you probably know is just rife with all these cultural elements. Montezuma was fearful of his life because what he had done to overtake the Toltecs, and then he feared this conqueror from the east, and then here comes Cortez, and all this, of course, is accidental, but in the mythological realm, it's not. And so the Aztec culture is one we may know more about. So hydraulic agriculture, which again is a major innovation, is part of the agricultural revolution, wherever it happens, is to be able to get water to crops, right? That is like one of the greatest technologies humanity's ever invented. If you can get water to crops, which means you're by a river, you can settle. You can stop hunting and gathering. You can stop changing homes with the seasons. You can build things. You can make a civilization because you've stopped. You've settled. You have a permanent source of food. There were also in the north the Anasazi. Anybody seen those ruins? The southwest here, Colorado, Mesa Verde, all over. Chaco Canyon was their main site. They were incredible. They built 30-foot wide roads for 400 miles. Again, these are city-states, so they dominate not only the city limits, but the landscape and the peoples all around them. They are the ancestors of the Pueblos, as best we can tell. The highways connected some 75 different communities. And then Chaco was this amazing cultural center. Again, there's a really good, extremely long documentary available on YouTube called 500 Nations that I would recommend you see. And it goes into great detail about each of these centers. Right, so Cahokia, more than 10,000 people here on the Mississippi River. It was larger than London during its time. Again, we tend to lop off the Americas until the 15th or 16th century, but it was a thriving center of mound builders. You may have heard of the mound builders. When I was living in the South, I would go see these mounds. They are incredible. They're very large and hard to imagine anyone constructing these without machinery. But they are there. And then finally, the Haudenosaunee, or the Iroquoian Confederacy. This is in the Northeast. The Six Nations combined to share food, to repel other enemies who wanted that food. They developed these agricultural villages and hunting grounds, had a democratic organization based on the land that the framers of the Constitution borrowed from to create America. They were matrilineal and matriarchal. Some of you were here for the Gods and Monsters course, and I guess I got pretty dark, and somebody said, "Can you just give us a positive myth?" And I did, and it was the story of the woman who fell from the sky from this nation. All right. So if you want to look into this more, there's Charles Mann's great 1491 book, and then Roxanne Dunbar Otey's An Indigenous People's History of the United States. What do we see? What what was America before it was America? Well, governance was by consensus. It was self-governance. There was the Great Law of Peace, which we know as the Golden Rule. I mean, it's all over the world, right? It's basically you do unto others as you would have others do unto you to keep the peace. It's a very pragmatic law, but at the same time it has a kind of, well, pretty much what we would call a deontological sense. Sorry for that. Means it's metaphysical. It's not metaphysical. It's theoretical. It's abstract as well as very practical. Sorry, been on a plane all day. The land was really interesting. What you'll get and we'll look at this in just a few minutes. What you'll get is Europeans coming here and saying it was overgrown. You know, it was a wilderness, a wildness. And we'll see that there's a very good reason they used that word. And in fact, that was not the case. Native Americans loved fire, and they used it deftly to create parks. Because what good, I mean, you do have to live on the land, right? So what good is land that's just made of undergrowth and brambles? Game doesn't stay there. Even if it did, you couldn't get to it. You can't plant anything there. So they would regularly burn things down, and that would decimate the undergrowth and create basically a park. And so you get other people coming to the continent who don't have this wildness agenda, and they're like, I could ride a horse for days through this tribe's land because it was cleared. And it just makes sense. You need it cleared to plant, you need it cleared to hunt, you need it cleared to live. And so, really, the continent, for the most part, was a giant park. Now, obviously, that occurs only in the eastern woodlands, in the north woods, but you get the sense of land management here. We're going to use fire to keep it under control. As you know, bison were just all over the continent. There's a reason Buffalo, New York is called Buffalo, New York. There were buffalo there, and all over the continent. And that, too, was a mainstay for the native peoples of the plains and where the bison were. There were also roads. So people traveled. They moved back and forth. Again, there were these great city-states along these river valleys or in Chaco Canyon. And people needed to go, needed to travel. People have always needed to travel. We've always been migrants, the human race. And so there were roads. In fact, some of the roads we drive on right now, right? All right. So that's the continent before. Hard to recover because there wasn't much writing. There were the Mayan hieroglyphics, like we said, but hard to decipher. And mostly, well, completely oral cultures. So spoken word only, which disappears like breath. So we have to rely on archaeological evidence, which is notoriously difficult to interpret, right? All right. Then what happens? Well, what happens is contact. Christopher Columbus, Amerigo Vespucci, Las Casas, Sepulveda. I'm going to take some time here on this slide because I want you to hear, I want you to realize what I just went over. This is our best understanding of what the continent was like. And then I want you to hear Europeans landing on the continent and interpreting it. Now, you do not interpret with a blank slate. No one does. That's really impossible. You interpret through the myths you hold, through the myths that hold you. So, Think about that. This is incredibly important. I'm going to spend a little time here, so bear with me. And I'm going to read to you. I apologize, but I'm going to read to you a little bit. But these are the voices from the time that created America. And I want you to see if you recognize anything. So Cristobal Colon, or I'm probably butchering that in Spanish, sorry. Christopher Columbus lands on what he called Hispaniola, which is now we call Haiti and the Dominican Republic. And he was lost. He thought he was in Southeast Asia. Important point. The people of this island and all the other islands which I have found, and of which I have information, all go naked. Okay. Men and women, as their mothers bore them, although some of the women cover a single place with the leaf of a plant, or with a net of cotton which they make for this purpose. They have no iron, steel, or weapons, nor are they fitted to use them. This is not because they are not well built and of handsome stature, but because they are very marvelously timorous. It is true that, after they have been reassured and have lost this initial fear, this timorousness, they are so guileless and so generous with all that they possess that no one would believe it who has not seen it. They refuse nothing that they possess if it be asked of them. On the contrary, they invite anyone to share it and display as much love as if they would give their hearts. They are content with whatever trifle of whatever kind that may be given to them, whether it be of value or valueless. They do not hold any creed, nor are they idolaters. But they all believe that power and good are in the heavens, and were very firmly convinced that I, with these ships and men, came from the heavens. And in this belief, they everywhere received me after they had mastered their fear. This belief is not the result of ignorance, for they are, on the contrary, of a very acute intelligence, and they are men who navigate all those seas, so that it is amazing how good an account they give of everything. It is because they have never seen people clothed, or ships of such a kind, in all these islands. I saw no great diversity in the appearance of the people, or in their manners of language. On the contrary, they all understand each other, which is a very curious thing. In all these islands, it seems to me that all men are content with one woman, and to their chief or king they give as many as 20. It appears to me that the women work more than do the men. Some things don't change. I have not been able to learn if they hold private property. It seemed to me that all took a share in whatever anyone had, especially of food. Okay, that's interesting, right? Maybe not as bad as you thought. There are worse passages, but that's a general impression, okay? Interesting that he's wondering about private property. This is the birth of private property in Europe, or at least the notion of private property as a defining feature of your place. Okay, they go about naked. Amerigo Vespucci, the namesake of our country, right? The Italian explorer who mapped the coasts. Let's hear what he has to say on his first impressions. First then, as to the people. We found in those parts such a multitude of people as nobody could enumerate, a race, I say, gentle and amenable. All of both sexes go about naked, covering no part of their bodies, and just as they spring from their mother's wombs, so they go until death. They have indeed large, square-built bodies, well formed in proportion, in color verging upon a reddish. I think this has come to them because going about naked, have we mentioned that they go about naked? They are colored by the sun. They have two hair, plentiful and black, in their gaits, and when playing their games, they are agile and dignified. They are comely, too, of countenance which they nevertheless themselves destroy, for they bore their cheeks, lips, noses, and ears. They have another custom, very shameful and beyond all human belief, for their women, being very lustful, cause the private parts of their husbands to swell up to such a huge size that they appear deformed and disgusting. And this is accomplished by a certain device of theirs, the biting of certain poisonous animals. And in consequence of this, many lose their organs, which break through lack of attention and sorry, thought I could get through that. Which break through lack of attention, and they remain eunuchs. They have no cloth, either of wool, linen, or cotton, since they need it not. Neither do they have goods of their own, but all things are held in common. They live together without a king, without government. Each is his own master. The women, as I have said, go about naked and are very libidinous. Yet they have bodies which are tolerably beautiful and cleanly, nor are they so unsightly as one perchance might imagine, for inasmuch as they are plump, their ugliness is less apparent, which indeed is for the most part concealed by the excellence of their bodily structure. It was to us a matter of astonishment that none was to be seen among them who had a flabby breast, and those who had borne children were not to be distinguished from virgins by the shape and shrinking of the womb. And in other parts of the body, similar things were seen, of which, in the interest of modesty, I make no mention. When they had the opportunity of copulating with Christians, urged by excessive lust, they defiled and prostituted themselves. They defiled and prostituted themselves. They live 150 years, really, and rarely fall ill. And if they do fall victims to any disease, they cure themselves with certain roots and herbs. These are the most noteworthy things I know about them. Now, this does not happen in a vacuum. The discovery of the New World was a major event in European history. Shakespeare writes about it in The Tempest. Last time we talked about Thomas Hobbes, he mentioned it. It's a really big deal. And so news of this new world spreads very quickly. Columbus's letters do not get out very quickly, but this does. Amerigo Vespucci wrote a pamphlet. This comes from a pamphlet he wrote, and it got disseminated throughout Europe very quickly. Anybody want to guess why? Well, there's that. They're naked, so it's porn. Something happens in 1534, printing press. So this was one of the main products of the printing press when it emerged in Germany. Okay, so just think about, these impressions of Columbus and Vespucci. Very quickly, of course, Europeans start pouring in: the Spanish, the Portuguese, the English, the French. There was a Dominican friar who came shortly after Columbus and stayed there on the islands to do his duty to God. And his name was Bartolome de las Casas, and he wrote a book called he wrote several, but basically translated as The Devastation of the Indies, 1542. Las Casas was terrified that the Spanish were going to be punished by God for what they were doing less than 50 years after landfall. He was terrified. He pleaded with the Spanish not to colonize the islands and the Americas, but especially not to do it the way they were doing it, which was brutal. It was murderous. It was rape. It was genocide. So I don't know if you know that, but you should know that there was a Spanish voice. And he goes back to Spain and argues that this should not happen. That too doesn't get told in the story. He was genuinely terrified. Here's what he says in one of his arguments. He actually goes back to Madrid and has a debate with Sepulveda, who we'll see next. And this is what he says about the people he's met in the Indies. God created these simple people without evil and without guile. They are the most obedient and faithful to their natural lords and to the Christians whom they serve. They are the most submissive, patient, peaceful, and virtuous. Nor are they quarrelsome, rancorous, querulous, or vengeful. Moreover, they are more delicate than princes and die easily. It's a great line, actually. More delicate than princes. And die easily from work or illness. They neither possess nor desire to possess worldly wealth. It's a very important description. Surely these people would be the most blessed in the world if they only worship the one true God. So we would like for Las Casas to be a little more broad-minded, but he was the most broad-minded person of his time, as we would define it. His description is patronizing, it's inaccurate in some ways, and he's out to convert them, but at least he can see the violence, the rape, the torture, the genocide, and try to stop it. That's worth noting. Compared to Sepulveda, who says this: now compare the Spanish's gifts of prudence, talents, magnanimity, temperance, humanity, and religion. So, compare us, the Spanish, with all these virtues, with those little men. The word is actually homunculus. Those little men in whom you will scarcely find traces of humanity, who not only lack culture, but do not even know how to write. Remember? That's the key, writing. They do not know how to write, who keep no records of their history, except certain obscure and vague reminiscences of some things put down in certain pictures, and who do not have written laws, but only barbarous institutions and customs. But if you deal with the virtues, if you look for temperance or meekness, what can you expect from men who are involved in every kind of intemperance and wicked lust, and who used to eat human flesh? There it is, right? We had to play that card. Who eat human flesh. And don't think that before the arrival of the Christians, they were living in quiet and Saturnian peace of the poets. He's pretty good, you got it. Don't think they were living in quiet and the Saturnian peace of the poets. On the contrary, they were making war continuously and ferociously against each other with such rage that they considered their victory worthless if they did not satisfy their monstrous hunger with the flesh of their enemies, an inhumanity which in them is so much more monstrous, since they are so distant from the unconquered and wild Scythians, who also fed on human flesh. For these Indians are so cowardly and timid that they scarcely withstand the appearance of our soldiers, and often many thousands of them have given ground, fleeing like women before a very few Spaniards who did not even number 100. Interesting, right? These are the earliest reports from Europeans of the America before it was America. Yeah. We've moved over. Sorry. Vespucci mapped the whole South American coast, and now we're getting reports from the North American continent. So yeah, It's widening. Thank you, Charlie. That's a good point. What's happening here? Two myths are being born. Two myths that are with us today. One is called the noble savage. One is called the savage. It's all right there. They both can't be true, or maybe, but there's no explanation for them, except there is mythologically. So part of the noble savage myth is this. About 1,300 years ago, 13,000 years ago, a group of people from Asia crossed the Bering Strait, which was frozen. Did you get this in school? Yeah. They were small, isolated groups. They made little impact on the environment. They were basically wild animals who just foraged and didn't build anything. And so the continent, the North American continent and the South American continent, basically was wild. Okay, now that's part of the noble savage, is this notion of innocence. Right? Afterwards, after contact, we saw Las Casas, and we heard his descriptions of these people who are pretty much saintly, right? I mean, they're just beautiful, wonderful people. If they only worship the one true God, they would be almost perfect. We have, so I want to point out that these two myths are running together simultaneously. Here's another one. Let me read you from Las Casas again. The Spaniards' reason for killing and destroying such an infinite number of souls is that the Christians have an ultimate aim, which is to convert them? No. To acquire gold. And to swell themselves with riches in a very brief time, and thus rise to a high estate disproportionate to their merits. Again, any of this sound familiar today? Think about that. It was the same rhetorical and ideological movement of the Crusades, which was get a bunch of people who don't have anything, get them to go fight for our larger ideological purpose, and then promise them land in exchange. Yeah. Analogies abound, don't they? Who fights the wars? And why do they fight them? Pietro Martir de Anghiera shares the noble savage view. This is going to be hard to read because it's in Middle English. Indians, and the name is now Los Indios, right? Indians, partly because Columbus thinks and many people who came after him thought they were in Southeast Asia, but then eventually it becomes, well, indigenous, Los Indios, the indigenous ones. Indians, he wrote, 1556, live in that golden world of which old writers speak so much. Old here is spelled O-W-L-D-E. I like that. They live in that golden world of which old writers speak so much. I'm talking about Hesiod, by the way. Existing simply and innocently without enforcement of laws. Noble savage. George Bancroft, 1834, kind of a proto-anthropologist in a way, says that before Europeans arrived in North America, the continent was an unproductive waste. Its only inhabitants were a few scattered tribes of feeble barbarians destitute of commerce and political connection. All right, so again, the word noble here is being used as a synonym for innocent or without knowledge. Joseph Smith, founder of Mormonism, rediscovers the 10 lost tribes in America. And it's Indios, Los Indios. We can get to that story another time. Anybody remember the crying Indian of the 70s? Right? What was that guy's name? He just died recently. Cody. Iron Eyes Cody. Right. So I'm ancient enough to remember this. It was what's that? No, did he? That's amazing. I love Los Angeles for that. Of course. Anyway, the commercial for those young people here was, help me, what I remember is he was standing on a bluff looking over a highway, and people like me were just throwing trash out. And he turns and the camera zooms in and one tear comes down, right? Oh, I see some people remember. Very powerful. It was an incredibly powerful ad because it tapped into this myth, right? We messed it up. They did it right, and now we're messing it up. The noble savage. Hey, get back in touch with your noble savage and clean your shit up, right? Yes. One of the myths was this noble savage myth. I didn't mention Rousseau, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, we talked about last time, who imagines native people on the continent as in pretty much a perfect state. And there has to be few of them so that they don't make a government. But as soon as you make a government or a social contract, it's all gone to hell. So that was a very active myth in Europe. Because, and again, all these things tie together, because you have a new world. What does that mean? It means you get to rewrite things. You get to start over, right? Of course, you carry the same myths with you. And so there are numerous references to this continent as Eden. As Eden. How powerful is that? We've been trying to get back to the garden all our lives and throughout all our history as a species. There it is. It's an empty wilderness, ready for us to return to it. Yeah. Who fights the wars? We can come back to that, but it's always people in service of an ideology that they may not know. That happens today. I mean, this is just statistics. People who fight the wars are poorer than most. They are younger than most. They do it sometimes, much of the time, to survive. And that's an old story, too. Does that help? Okay, I'm going to get to some more of that stuff you were talking about. The New Age movement, we talked about a little bit in our World Religions course last fall, appropriates a lot of Native American mythology and ceremony to their own ends. So, the noble savage. You will see it all over. You will see it in films. Once you know it, you will see it everywhere. But there's also the savage. This comes especially from the French when they invaded in the Northeast in St. Lawrence River. And their word for the native people they met, some of which would have been Iroquois, sauvage, which is wild. And this is a resonant concept in Europe, is wildness. Because by this point, there's not much wildness left in Europe. Everything's been covered over, built upon, or at least owned by someone. Jung called this the disenchantment of nature. But here was wildness. The word implies everything outside of Christianity. Right? And if you want to see this depicted better than I could ever explain it to you, just read The Scarlet Letter. Hawthorne's The Scarlet Letter. You've got this nice little Christian community, but you've got this woman because woman and wildness go together. Woman and nature are fused in American mythology. Who goes out into the wildness, the wilderness, with, what's his name? The Chillingsworth? No. Dimmesdale, sorry. Right? So, the community, the religious community is safe, it is sacred. Out there is Satan. Not just danger, it's Satan is out there. That's where he lives. So, what does wild mean to Europeans? It means uncanny, unruly, raw, unpredictable, foreign, uncultured, uncultivated, right? This is what we came from. We don't want to go back to it. We want cities. We want a permanent source of food. It's all these things. Nakedness. Remember all those references to their nakedness? It's a sign, a semiotic, a cultural sign for wildness, anti-Christian. Sexual passion and promiscuity, right? We read about it. I love how the native people defiled themselves by copulating with the Christians. The Christians didn't defile themselves because they are wild. Polygamy, warfare, revenge, we heard it all, right? Cannibalism, you've always got to play that card when you meet something other, people who are other. Human sacrifice, and of course, lack of hygiene. Dude, you're French in the 16th and 17th century, you shouldn't be speaking about hygiene. I can say that because that's my heritage. We saw they were more hygienic than the Europeans, and it confused them. But no, we've got to categorize them as wild, and all these meanings come along with it. All right, wrapping up here. The Indian in America, all in quotation marks, right? The Indian becomes mirror. If we were in the last course, we would say the Indian is both God and monster. The Indian is a mirror, and I use the term advisedly. So when you look at the Indian, you don't see the Indian. You see yourself. Which part of yourself do you see? Well, it depends on your mood that day. Depends on your culture. Depends on your intention, right? You might see the God, the noble savage, something you lost, something you still feel, or at least you can idealize, but you can't quite reach. And I want that. I want to go back to the garden and be the noble savage, or at least the innocent savage, and not have to deal with all this history, right? Just start over. The Indian is also the other, a threat so different that he and she is a threat, are a threat. And so, what do Europeans, what do Westerners do when they meet the other? This is almost as a rule as much as the first law of thermodynamics. You meet the other, you diminish her. And I use her particularly for a reason, because woman is the oldest other. But culturally, not in terms of gender, but culturally, when you meet the other, you diminish it. If we had a psychologist here, we could say a lot about that process. Why would you want to do that? Why would you need to do that? Let me finish up here and we'll get to more questions. So, by no accident, race becomes a category in Europe after contact. Race, whiteness becomes a theme in Europe. Why? Because you encountered the other. You thought you all were different, You thought the Spanish were different from the French and the English? Ha! Look at these people. Suddenly, it's kind of a reverse Los Indios, right? So Europe now becomes Christendom, right? We got one big category here. We had a bunch of little categories. Now we got one big category. And they are them. It tells you, it reinforces the notion that this was an empty land. And it ties directly into the Hebrew Bible's notion of the land of Canaan, the land of milk and honey. This is, this is associative thinking. It's not logical thinking, it's the mythological. If I'm a European in the 16th century and I understand there's a new world, and I believe what I believe, I think it's the promised land for me. That's easy. That's an easy step, right? And in fact, it happened. All right, let me finish up and we'll get to even more awesome questions. So yes, this is the birth of race, the concept of race, which is not biological, I assume you know. It is cultural. There is no such thing as race. There is racism. And this is where it starts, because you have to define yourself against another. And if you're a Westerner, you're always going to do that by diminishing the other. So, how did we erase, are we erasing the native nation? By the way, this is, you won't find a better book on this than Robert Burkhalter's The White Man's Indian. I've read it a dozen times. I reread it for this. It's absolutely meticulous in documentation and brilliant in interpretation. And so this is Robert Burkhalter. Generalizing from one tribe, society, and culture to all Indians. Los Indios, right? I mean, when this started, we actually have speeches from some of the chiefs who are like, why are you calling us Indians? Like, I'm at war with these people. What? Why are we the same? Generally confused. Los Indios. Conceiving of Indians in terms of their deficiencies according to white ideals rather than in terms of their own various cultures. We saw that, right? Did I mention they were naked? I should say, again, for the sake of the record, that Franz Boas, the founder of American anthropology, tries to remedy this in the early 20th century. So I don't know if you know him, but he's worth looking at. Using moral evaluation as a description of Indians. We don't see that today, do we? With the other. All right. So, oh, yeah, I wanted to read you Burkhalter, sorry. Hang on a second. Almost done. Just listen briefly. Since whites primarily understood the Indian as an antithesis to themselves, then civilization and Indianness, as they defined them, would forever be opposites. Only civilization had history and dynamics, so therefore Indianness must be conceived as ahistorical and static. If the Indian changed through the adoption of civilization as defined by whites, then he was no longer truly Indian. You've seen that move before? With African Americans, for example. According to the image, because the Indian was judged by what whites were not. And a lot of that happened. Change toward what whites were made him ipso facto less Indian. Indians who remained alive and resisted adoption of civilization appeared to accept white vices instead of virtues, and so became those imperfect creatures, the savage, the degraded or reservation Indian. If there's a third major white image of the Indian, then this degraded, often drunken Indian constitutes the essence of that understanding. Living neither as an assimilated white nor is an Indian of the classic image, and therefore neither noble nor wildly savage, but always scorned. The degraded Indian exhibited the vices of both societies, in the opinion of white observers. Degenerate and poverty-stricken, these unfortunates were presumed to be outcasts from their own race, who exhibited the worst qualities of Indian character with none of its redeeming features. Since white commentators pitied when they did not scorn this degenerate Indian, the image carried the same unfavorable evaluation overall as the bad or savage Indian. All right. So, what happened? Before contact, there's a critic who offered this quote, and I couldn't remember it. But she says, when language touches land, space is created. And that's what was on the continent, space. Cultural, religious, meaningful space, because language had touched land. After contact, we have, as an American nation, a pattern. We have now developed the pattern for the treatment of others in this country with this contact. And we saw it, we heard it right from the mouths of the contact. It's the roots of the religious nation that we're going to talk about next time. This, right here. It's the roots of white supremacy. This, right here. America is then a haunted space. A haunted space. And if you think about it, I bet you have, the reason you're here is because you might know this. You might know that you're in haunted space. So, you can, Louise Erdrich, Christ's twin. She's from the Turtle Mountain Band of the Chippewa. And it begins, he was born of chicken blood and lightning. I love this. Because this is Orozco's Christ, by the way, who's chopped down his own cross. Christ's twin is Louise Erdrich doing to Western mythology what Western mythology did to her people. And so she takes the twins motif, and that is very common throughout the world, but especially in Native American cultures. Twins are the culture heroes who bring culture to the people. And she flips it and sends it back to Christ. He was born of chicken blood and lightning, Christ's twin. So you know there's always a good twin and always a bad twin? Christ's twin. I'll try to find out while we're talking if you're interested. Thank you.